Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who was on the selection committee and went into choosing my essay for this award. It is an honor to be here and address you today. As Dr. Monk said, I'm a second-year Master of Divinity student at Perkins School of Theology. A bit more about myself: I was born in Houston, Texas, grew up in Liberty, Texas. For those that don't know where that is, it's about halfway between Houston and Beaumont. I earned my Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Lamar University. I'm currently at Perkins School of Theology, and my United Methodist Church membership followed me from the Texas Annual Conference to now Lover's Lane United Methodist in Dallas, North Texas Conference. And the church where I became a member initially was the First United Methodist Church of Liberty, Texas, of which Reverend James G. Hardin, the circuit-riding Methodist preacher, John Wesley Hardin's father, was a minister.
Wow.
And when I was 19 years old, I was thrown onto this committee that was the 175th anniversary celebration planning committee. And my task was to go and collect articles and photographs and interview as many people as possible, because I suddenly found myself making a video of a church I was just baptized into and knew nothing about, but I had to make this video. And that's when I came across the story of John Wesley Hardin. And this paper originally began as a research paper for Dr. Ted Campbell for United Methodist History, and I was interested in bringing psychology and the church together. I'm currently pursuing possible PhD programs in Christian ethics to try and strengthen the relationship between the secular psychology community and the church, not only to help clergy, but also to bring affordable care to laity who could not otherwise receive that care. It's a bit of a problem, I think, if laity come to a clergy person and reveal, be it issues of abuse, etc., and they're in a rural area and the pastor then has to refer them 50 to 100 miles away for a specialist. That significantly decreases the chances that that person will go and get the care they need. So a little bit about the sources and repositories that I access that were really helpful, and you all can access them too. At Bridwell Library, we have a wonderful online version of John Wesley Hardin's autobiography that he wrote while he was in prison. And it was published in 1896. I pulled heavily from the minutes of the annual conferences of the Methodist Episcopal Church South to try and trace where Reverend James G. Hardin was placed and moved around as an itinerant circuit-riding preacher. I used Walter N. Vernon's The Methodist Excitement in Texas, which Dr. Monk and, I don't know your last name, I'm sorry, Rob contributed to. And you can also access certain records and historical documents through Ancestry, Ancestry.com. I went in and created my own, Hardin family tree. So that was fun to do. I got the Texas convict ledgers from Ancestry. I got the 1860 federal census record from Ancestry, placing the family, because they disappeared from church historical records after 1861, so you couldn't trace where they were living, but I found them in 1860, located, I believe, in Trinity. So that's where the family was after they dropped off the church's radar. I also pulled from psychological literature, the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, specifically the article pertaining to parenting as a protective factor against criminal settings. Also the Journal of Child and Family Studies, article on delinquent delinquency, is too much or too little parental control a problem? And the Journal of Adolescence, maternal and paternal parenting styles, unique and combined links to adolescence and early adult delinquency. And I pulled from several secondary sources, and I tried to trace my secondary sources to their primary source. And I traced it to the Robert G. McCubbin collection. Unfortunately, as I was going through this process, I found the collection was auctioned off to the highest bidder this year, January 25th and 26th in Arizona. Every item was sold to a separate private bidder. And as a student, I had no idea that historians did that. I just kind of assumed everything was either located at a university where I could access it, or maybe perhaps the living descendants of the family had those records. So when I found that this collection that had existed since before my birth was being separated right when I needed it, I was not happy. But throughout this process, what I really was wondering was, as a circuit-riding Methodist preacher, how in the world did a child of a Methodist preacher become one of the most notorious desperados that Texas ever produced? And John Wesley Hardin's story began when he was an adolescent. He was 14 years old when he had experienced his first stabbing at a school. He got into an altercation and stabbed a boy who almost died. And then the following year, at the age of 15, he had killed an African American named Mage. At 15 years old. And the majority of the killings occurred before he was 21. Anyway, I began wondering, for someone to have committed these killings before they were 21 years old, because this person would have been about my age, what was the home life like for this individual? What was his relationship like with his father, with his mother? Or was it a lack thereof, because circuit-riding preachers were on the circuit and often absent? Sometimes they took the family with them, but in cases where the preacher deemed it safer for the family to stay put, obviously the minister was absent. So I was really curious about that. You all received a handout, and I want to address that very quickly. My purpose in generating this handout for y'all, I wanted to put a face to the story. So on the first picture is a reward wanted poster, $5,000, 40 times a killer. And just to put it in perspective, I took into account the inflation rate and all of that, or what $5,000 in 1874 would be today. This reward poster would have been for $110,867 for this one individual to be brought in by the Texas Rangers. The bottom photograph is a picture of John Wesley Hardin himself. On the following page, at the top is the only photograph that I could find really of Reverend James G. Hardin, but that is the circuit-riding Methodist preacher. And then throughout the handout, the remainder of it, I go into different statistics of pastoral burnout. I'm not going to go through all of those with you. You can read them on your own time. But some of them, to put in perspective for laity that may be present, and the type of stress and pressure that our clergy face, and of course we don't talk about. 45% of pastors admitted that they have experienced depression or burnout. 94% of pastors feel under pressure to have the perfect family. 75% reported being extremely stressed. 90% work between 55 and 75 hours a week. 90% feel fatigued every week. And on average, seminary-trained pastors like myself going into ministry last only 5 years before we drop. So some of these statistics are just very, very startling. 70% constantly fight depression. And these are statistics mostly pulled from a book written, Pastors at Greater Risk, and a lot of these studies were done by our own Asbury Theological Seminary that reported these stats, and you can find a full list of sources on page 5 of your handout if you want to go and explore those on your own time. Now, to get into the meat of this paper, John Wesley Hardin was born May 26, 1853 in Bonham, Fannin County, Texas, to Reverend James G. Hardin, a Methodist circuit rider, and Mary Elizabeth Dixon. Reverend Hardin baptized his son with the name John Wesley after the founder of our faith. However, instead of living up to this religious morality of his namesake, he became the most notorious desperado Texas had ever seen. And as I said, I wondered, how could a Methodist preacher's boy grow up to garner this reputation? And who was this Methodist circuit rider? So Reverend Hardin, unfortunately, was not one of the circuit riders for whom we have written journals. I really wish we did have that. And somewhere I read in one of my secondary sources that journals do exist, but I don't know where they are. So they're out there somewhere where Reverend Hardin would write letters to his wife, back and forth. I'm assuming that perhaps they're still kept in the family somewhere. In 1841, at the age of 18, Reverend Hardin purchased land in Liberty County, which is my home county, to begin farming. However, he failed at farming, so he became a Methodist preacher. So Reverend Hardin was admitted to the Texas Conference on Trial in 1845, and he was stationed in the Washington District at Nashville with Reverend Lorenzo D. Bragg. He remained on trial until 1847. And at that point, in 1847, Reverend Hardin was officiating at a wedding of a Susanna Louise Dixon, the daughter of the town's doctor, William, and she was wed to William Anderson. And while organizing this wedding, Reverend Hardin met his future wife in the sister, Susanna's sister, Mary Elizabeth Dixon. And Elizabeth was Dr. Dixon's 8th child. She was described as being deeply religious, having long, honey blonde hair with bright blue eyes that enhanced a beautiful smile. Reverend Hardin and Elizabeth Dixon were wed in Navajo County in May of 1847. They were 24 years old and 20 years old, respectively, he being older. And they had only known each other for 4 months. Together they had 10 children, the first of whom died during childbirth. John Wesley Hardin was their 3rd son. Wes Hardin's friend, Jim Stevens, describes Wes Hardin's father as a circuit-riding Methodist preacher. The description ended there. And he described the mother as an attractive, intelligent, loving homemaker and wife who especially was good at making fried chicken and peach cobbler. And from the time of his birth until he was a teenager, Wes lived the itinerant lifestyle required by his father's vocation. Reverend Hardin was not only a Methodist circuit rider, but he also dabbled in school teaching and law practice, and he continued to make failed attempts at farming. He just did not want to give that up, even though the first attempt should have been an indicator. So Reverend Hardin moved around several times. He moved to the East Texas Conference, admitted on trial in 1848, and he was stationed in San Augustine at Trinity. He remained there and was stationed with E.P. Chisholm at the Trinity District. He was admitted as a deacon in full connection to the East Texas Annual Conference in Paris, Texas, November 14th of 1849. He then accepted an assignment at the First Methodist Episcopal Church South in Dallas, Texas. He was their 5th minister, and he was there through 1850. He was relocated to the Balaam Circuit in Clarksville District of East Texas Conference, and he was finally elected to the Order of Elder in 1852 in East Texas Conference. After John Wesley Hardin was born in 1853, the annual conference minutes list Reverend Hardin as superannuated, worn out, retired, and I had to ask Tim and some others what superannuated was. I had no idea what that was. But what was really surprising is he was listed as superannuated and worn out, and he was only 30 years old. But apparently, according to Wes Hardin's younger sister, Maddie, she recalled that her father survived a severe bout of whooping cough, and it left him with a chronic coughing spasms that really hampered his ability to preach. So he was forced to reduce his preaching load. Also, he could have taken time off at that time because his son was born. He came out of retirement in 1858, where he was placed at my home church, then the First Methodist Episcopal Church South in Liberty, Texas, alongside Reverend Harwin M. Moore, though he was still listed as superannuated, even though he was placed there. After serving in Liberty, he was listed as located, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where he dropped out of the official church records. However, the federal census data places he and his family in Sumter. It was Trinity County, Texas. One of the interesting things about Reverend Hardin is, even though he was originally born in Tennessee and came to Texas, he was one of the reverends that voted against secession when the Civil War broke out, and also he was against slavery. Texas at the time had 182,566 slaves in 1860, and it had grown from 5,000 documented just 10 years prior to that. While most of the Texas Methodists defended slavery, Reverend Hardin was one of few that opposed it. However, when Texas did vote to secede, Reverend Hardin sided with Texas and was willing to die for Southern states' rights. He was elected captain of the company, but resigned because the community implored him to stay in order to conduct funeral services throughout the Civil War. So he was replaced as captain of his company by Captain Ballinger, who I believe was from Galveston. Wes Hardin recounted that when he was 9 years old, and this was the first kind of hinting at his going against his father's wishes, he received a sound thrashing because he wanted to run off with a cousin of his to join the rebel cause. One of the things from Wes Hardin's autobiography is he states that their parents taught them to be honest, truthful, brave. However, they were also taught that brave boys did not let others call them liars without facing consequences. And Wes Hardin admitted, this may have led to many of my altercations with other students. One such altercation, which I mentioned previously, almost turned fatal. Wes Hardin recalled this took place in 1867, and the boy's name was Charles Sloter. Sloter drew a knife on him. Hardin also drew his knife, stabbed Slaughter twice, once in the breast, once in the back, and he almost killed him. He was 14 years old at this time. He also visited his Uncle Barnett in Livingston, Texas, and this location in Livingston was one of the many failed attempts of his father at farming. So not knowing what else to do with the property, Reverend Hardin just gave it to his brother. And Wes went to visit, and on this trip is when he came in contact with the African-American slave named Mage, with whom he got into an altercation, and he claims in self-defense, he drew his Colt .44 6-shooter and killed Mage. He was apprehended by Union soldiers that were nearby during Reconstruction, and he killed 3 of the Union soldiers. He committed his first 4 killings in 1868 when he was 15 years old. Reverend Hardin did not believe his son would receive a fair trial. And in January of 1869, he took Wes to Navarro County, where he helped teach at a school near Pisgah. Wes's brother Joe tried to convince him that he needed to leave the area, and later that year they went down to Brazos to visit a relative named Jim Page. And on Christmas Eve, Reverend Hardin went to visit his 2 sons at Jim Page's. And Wes took his father's horse into town, and he was supposed to be doing grocery shopping, but he got into racing the horse for money winnings. And wouldn't you know it, he got into another altercation with the locals and killed Jim Bradley. He returned to Page's home at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and he woke his father and told him what happened. And Reverend Hardin was so upset because he wanted Wes to come home for Christmas, where the rest of the family was. He wanted him to come home. Wes told his father he would still go, he would still come home, but just wait until the following night, until things start to die down. But Wes Hardin found really quickly that the townspeople were hunting him down for killing Jim Bradley, and they intended on lynching him for this murder. So Wes and his father agreed to meet at a disclosed location on the night of December 26th. However, Reverend Hardin found that he was being watched too closely and couldn't leave to meet up with his son. So he sent a friend, a Masonic friend named Martin, to tell Wes not to return home. And after Martin left, Wes was surrounded by a mob. He said he would surrender to the law, but not a mob. He fired on the mob, possibly killing more people, and escaped to Navarro County. All of these killings, Wes, throughout his autobiography, continues to claim they were all in self-defense. He killed a man named Jim Smalley, stole his horse, rode to his father's home in Mount Calm, Texas in January of 1871. Reverend Hardin just gave his son another horse, turned the stolen horse loose, and Wes left his father's home bound for Mexico because his father was very insistent. You need to get out of the country. If you're apprehended, this is not going to turn out well for you. However, leaving for Mexico, he was apprehended between Belton and Waco. He killed his apprehenders, returned to his father. He told his father what had happened. Well, his version was he had been apprehended while he was sleeping by men claiming to be police officers, but he wasn't certain they would tell him the truth. So he killed them to escape. And finally, this is the first time that Reverend Hardin actually makes a statement where he says, "I just don't believe you." This is the first instance. Don't say another word to anyone, but I don't believe you. Regardless, though, whether you're telling the truth or not, you need to get to Mexico. So Reverend Hardin rode with his son as far as Belton, escorted him, and then they parted ways. Wes went to see relatives in Gonzales. He still did not get to Mexico. Can you see a pattern here? He doesn't really listen to his father. The relatives took him on a cattle drive to Kansas City to make more money. Wes visited his father and mother in Mount Calm, Texas twice more near Christmas in 1871 to check on their well-being before going back to Gonzales County. Wes Hardin remained on the run for a couple of years, but he did find time to marry Jane Bowen in 1872. She had a child, and in 1873, Wes sent his wife and newborn baby to visit his parents because it was safer to visit the parents than be with him. Wes met his wife at their parents' home, and he went to collect them, and they returned to Gonzales County. He again, in 1874, had to send his wife and child back to his parents because he needed to go on yet another cattle drive to Kansas City. Wes returned to Comanche later that month, and he killed Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb, who, according to Wes Hardin, had planned to assassinate him. Not sure how that... I'm not sure of the rationale there, but that's what he said in his autobiography, that he was going to assassinate him. He had no intentions of bringing me in lawfully. He was just going to assassinate me. A mob tried to capture Wes and his cattle drive buddies in the town, and his father and brother came running with shotguns in hand to help. And it was at that moment that Wes decided that he and his posse should leave because he feared that his family members would get caught in the crossfire. As it was, the mob killed Wes's brother Joe. Bill Waller, the captain of the Texas Rangers, arrested Reverend Hardin and placed him under guard so that he wouldn't be able to communicate with his son about the location of search parties and things of that nature. Regardless, Reverend Hardin did get a message via a friend to Wes to tell him that his brother was killed. And he also said in this message that if the mob found Wes and found out that he was still in the country, the Reverend's life and that of his wife and child were in jeopardy. But even with that warning, Reverend Hardin told him not to surrender under any circumstances. So he escaped again, reunited with his wife and child in New Orleans. They went to Gainesville, Florida, where he got involved in the saloon business under an alias, J.H. Swain. He sold his saloon business in 1875 and got into the butcher and liquor business. He continued in the cattle drive business also, but then his identity was discovered, so again, his wife and children had to escape and leave, and they fled to Alabama. But Wes Hardin was later arrested in Pensacola, Florida on July 23rd, 1877. Wes was tried for murder and sentenced to 25 years in the Huntsville State Penitentiary. He wrote back and forth with his wife. His wife, Jane, died from tuberculosis on November 6th, 1892. Her last letter written to Wes was dated the day before. And what I thought was really sad when I was writing this paper is she died in 1892. Wes was pardoned by the then governor of Texas and released from prison February 17, 1894. He was killed in El Paso, Texas in 1895, August 19th, by John Selman, an off-duty police officer. Reverend Hardin died at the age of 53, and he never saw his son arrested. There was a report of Reverend Hardin's passing found in the notes of the Texas Christian Advocate, dated December 28, 1876, submitted by a Reverend Oscar M. Addison, who was a fellow minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church South and a former Confederate chaplain who lived in Ennis at the time. The obituary read, Reverend Hardin was born in Tennessee on March 2nd, 1823, was converted and joined the Methodist Episcopal Church at an early age, was licensed to preach and admitted to the Texas Annual Conference in 1848. After his second year, he transferred to the East Texas Conference, where after several years of labor, he located and engaged in school teaching and law practice. Reverend Hardin died in Red River County, Texas on August 2nd, 1876. It's believed that by the time Wes Hardin had been imprisoned in October of 1878, he had killed 44 men. And he was even said to have outdrawn Wild Bill Hickok. Wes's friend, Jim Stevens, when asked about whether Wes Hardin could have turned out any other way, basically said he didn't believe he could have, given the nature of the Reconstruction era in Texas at the time. And he described the Reconstruction era as one of the most unjust, repressive periods in the history of the country, notwithstanding the slavery problems and its moral consequences. What I wanted to look at, however, was what did modern developmental psychology have to say about that? Could Wes Hardin's behavior have been the result of the absentee father? Or was it just a product of being raised in the Reconstruction era, as his friend had stated? According to a study done in 2017, it was found that levels of parental monitoring, along with the quality of the parent-adolescent relationship, lessen the effects of time spent in crime-conducive settings. In other words, if the relationship with your parent, the parent-child relationship, is good, the child will be less likely to go out into that crime-ridden environment. Time spent in these crime-conducive settings was also found to be related to increase in delinquency. However, it was conditional on the quality of the relationship with the parent. If parental monitoring and the quality of the relationship were adequate, then it didn't matter, really, about the time spent in Reconstruction-era Texas. Adolescents who spent had high levels of monitoring by their parents, and the relationship was good, they were less involved in delinquent activities. And not only do these relationships with the parents they served as a buffer. So, in other words, what this study is saying is, if the relationship was good, the monitoring was sufficient, perhaps this wouldn't have happened. A 2016 study added to this literature and said that the relationship is curvilinear, basically meaning if the monitoring is too little or if it's too much, if it's excessive, then the adolescent will still go out into these environments and engage in delinquent behavior. Also, single-parent households, meaning a household with an absentee parent, was found to be associated with even higher levels of delinquency among adolescents. Also, it was found that a father's parenting style in particular was directly linked to a boy's delinquency. A father's neglective parenting style could predict the son's delinquency as far as 5 years into the future. Fathers were found to have the most lasting influence on their son's behavior, and it exceeded that even of the mother. So even if Elizabeth Dixon would have been this all-star mother with her wonderful fried chicken and peach cobbler, the father wasn't there. And when he was there, he had several opportunities to discipline his son or turn him over to the law. And he didn't. So, a lot of this is speculative. But what I'm trying to propose is that perhaps Wes Hardin's delinquent behavior can be explained by an absent father in combination with a mother who, probably given the culture of the period, was not very authoritarian. And based on Wes Hardin's autobiography, his father helped him get out of the trouble almost at any opportunity that he had. So, looking at this story through the lens of developmental psychology, it reveals some interesting facets of the story that hasn't been explored before. And the parenting styles are applicable to today. This is very recent research done within the last 5 years. And while elders in the United Methodist Church no longer are on a circuit riding around on horseback, and their families move and itinerate with them, several face clergy burnout and become so overwhelmed that when they come home, they may not be as engaging with their family as they should. So I'm not saying that Reverend Hardin suffered from clergy burnout. It's probable that he did, but I can't prove that. What I am saying, however, is that perhaps clergy within their family home are experiencing a new age type of absenteeism, where they may be physically present, but they check out as soon as they come in the door and take off their shoes. And one of the statistics in your handout state that a large proportion of the wives and the families of our clergy don't feel like they fit in the church. They don't feel like they're a part of it. And then in their own home, they're still not getting their husband's attention, or the children aren't getting their father's attention. And of course, while this data and in the cultural context is dealing with male ministers, it definitely can apply to female ministers as well. So we face this problem of being physically present, but not engaging with our family. And so they're just not available. And I think that that's something that further research should look into to a larger extent than I was able to do in this 10-page paper. Looking at the effects of burnout on our clergy families. And for laity in the room, I don't hear clergy speak about burnout very often to laity. So I thought it was important to touch on this today. We work, we pour ourselves out, and we don't want to admit it because we want to keep giving and giving, but eventually the glass gets empty. And what would be helpful from laity, perhaps, would be to watch your clergy person, pray for them, volunteer, ask, is there anything that I can do for you to help serve our community, to help you in your ministry in this church? And I'll just conclude with today, as in Reverend Hardin's case, sometimes when your children are left unsupervised, then that can lead to a dead end with dire consequences. So at this time, I'll take questions if we have time, or cut it off.
I'm going to move on.
I'll be available afterwards for questions. Thank you.